China and Japan. China has the oldest culture on Earth. It is also the only major country in the world that has never been under European rule. For 2,000 years, after its unification in 221 BC, the Chinese Empire did not come into contact with any civilization that could compare to it. China was not interested in the outside world. It was considered inconceivable that the barbarians from beyond its borders had anything important to offer. It was the First Opium War, in 1840–1842, that forced China to begin its contacts with the West. Its wars with the West forced it to open its ports to foreign trade, becoming semi-colonial enclaves. For a century, its economy, its ports and its most important industries were at the mercy of foreign powers. The Chinese government became, in the words of Mao Zedong, the accounting office of our foreign masters. The colonial privileges established by the West in China in 1842 were finally abandoned a century later in 1943 at a time when much of China was dominated by Japan. During the first 50 years of its exploitation by European capital, China managed to keep Western ideas marginalized. The Chinese government sought refuge in the return to the old ways. Paradoxically, it was not Europe but Japan that was responsible for the end of Chinese intellectual isolation. For centuries, the Japanese were disparagingly called dwarf pirates in China, inferior beings who had copied their civilization. In 1895, China was badly defeated in a war with Japan and lost Formosa. The defeat inflicted by the dwarf pirates was the greatest humiliation in the entire history of the Chinese Empire. However, the cause of such humiliation was obvious. It rested on Japan's ability to learn from the West. It was then that certain Chinese intellectual circles concluded that traditional isolation had to end. Japan's response to the challenge from the West was different. Already in the 18th century, Japan quickly came to the conclusion that if it wanted to avoid the fate of China, it must learn the secrets of the strength of the West. The speed of Japanese modernization is unparalleled in the history of the modern world. In the 1850s, their islands were defenseless. Half a century later, in 1905, he inflicted a crushing defeat on Russia, which for most of the 19th century had been considered the greatest military power on the planet. The transformation of Japan into a modern state began with the accession of Emperor Matsuhito in 1867. For centuries, the emperor had been a simple figurehead, dominated by a clan of nobles, the Tokugawa, who had been the true rulers. But in 1867 the Tokugawa were overthrown by reformers who restored the authority and prestige of the emperor and managed to impose an ambitious reform program. Matsuhito gave his reign the name Meiji, or enlightened government. When he died in 1912, Japan possessed a large army, a modern fleet, and the foundations of an industrial economy. He had conquered Formosa and Korea, managing to establish himself in Manchuria, from where, in the 1930s, he would begin the conquest of China. Although he insisted on his divinity, Matsuhito granted Japan an autocratic system of government modeled on that of Bismarck's Germany, but in which military leaders had greater influence. At the outbreak of World War I, Japan's competitors were forced to abandon the fight for influence in China to concentrate on Europe. Japan took advantage of the situation to capture the German base at Kyushu, in mainland China, and take possession of all the German islands north of the Pacific. Even the United States, until then very suspicious of Japan's intentions, formally recognized, after its entry into the war, that Japan has special interests in China. The problem of the Far East, wrote the British minister in Peking at the end of the war, can now be defined as the problem of Japan's hegemony in China. Japanese hegemony in the Far East was guaranteed by an international conference held in Washington in 1921 to discuss the limitation of naval armaments. Japan agreed to limit its navy to 30% of those of Great Britain and the United States, and abandon Kyushu, although it retained the Pacific Islands it had seized from Germany. In exchange for such concessions, he got the West not to build naval bases within striking distance of his islands. Britain would not build any naval bases north of Singapore, nor the United States west of Hawaii. Japan would thus acquire naval hegemony of the Western Pacific. Anthony Eden, British Foreign Secretary before the Munich crisis, tried on several occasions to reach an agreement with the United States on the Far East, but the United States only committed itself to a moral condemnation of Japanese aggression. In addition to transforming Japan's political position, World War I also turned it into an industrial state for the first time. No country in the world, not even the United States, derived greater economic benefits from the war. Throughout Asia, Japan conquered markets that Europe had once dominated but was now unable to serve because of the war, and became a creditor nation. Until 1914, Japan always had a deficit with its balance of payments. During the war years alone it accumulated a commercial surplus of 1.4 billion yen, that is, a sum greater than the total value of its industrial production in 1913. Its gold reserves in the same period increased by almost 100%. China also played a role in making Japan the hegemon of Asia. Throughout history, the greatness of a country has invariably been founded on the weakness of its neighbors. This principle was as true in 20th century Japan as it had been in classical Rome, the France of Louis XIV, or the Germany of Adolf Hitler. The basis of Japanese power consisted less in its own strength than in China's weakness. China was 12 times larger than Japan in area, even after the conquests of the Meiji era. Its population was 8 times larger, and its natural resources were far superior. In the long run, China's modernization, begun at the beginning of the 20th century, would make it the greatest power in Asia, but in the short term it destroyed its internal cohesion. In the meantime, Japan dominated Asia. Chinese military leaders. Each of the dynasties that ruled China in the previous 2,000 years had claimed that their throne came from the command of heaven. Every time a dynasty was overthrown, its disappearance was interpreted by the Chinese people as a sign that heaven had withdrawn its rule. This is what happened with the fall of the Manchus in 1911. But with it the traditional dynastic model was interrupted. They were not succeeded by a new dynasty, but by a republic inspired by the foreign ideals of democracy. For fear of the effect they would have on the outside world, and precisely for this reason, China made sure of its dissemination in the United States. Pressure from world opinion forced Japan to modify its most extreme demands, but China was forced to give up the port of Kyushu and the privileges previously enjoyed by Germany, as well as to recognize the Japanese presence in Manchuria. In August 1917, the government in Peking gave in to American pressure to enter the war alongside the Allies. In the opinion of the United States, China could thus attend the peace conference and denounce Japanese pressure. Chinese delegations left for Paris at the end of the war, confident that the principle of self-determination that the Allies had proclaimed in Europe would also apply in China. What China did not know was that Britain and France had already committed themselves, through secret treaties, to supporting Japan. The Treaty of Versailles ignored Chinese claims and formally recognized the transfer to Japan of the former German base of Kyushu. The United States ambassador in Beijing wrote, "Probably no other country was as eager for American leadership to be definitively expressed in Paris as China." The Chinese trusted the United States. They trusted the frequent declarations of principles made by President Wilson, whose words reached the most remote corners of China. Their disappointment and disillusionment was total. I was worried to think how the Chinese people would receive that blow that meant the destruction of their hopes and their confidence in the fairness of the nations. The treatment of China by its allies transformed Chinese nationalism into a mass movement. Its leaders were the university leaders. On May 4, 1919, demonstrators participating in a protest march against the Paris Peace Conference, organized by students from Peking University, set fire to the house of Tsao Julin, who had negotiated the Chinese response to the 21 demands, and beat Chiang Sun-xiang, the former Chinese minister in Tokyo, who managed to save his life thanks to the arrival of troops. The May 4th movement, as it became known, had spread to most cities and towns and mobilized 20 million people in a series of strikes, demonstrations, and boycotts of Japanese goods. In response to pressure from the movement, Chinese delegates at the Paris Peace Conference refused to sign the Treaty of Versailles, which no longer had the signature of the three largest independent nations in the world, China, Russia, and the United States. One of the leaders of the movement, in Hunan, was the young Mao Zedong, then an ardent nationalist. In his pamphlet entitled The Great Union of the Popular Masses, written in July 1919, he stated, "We young people live in the 20th century, but the Chinese leaders still force us to respect the old traditions. The country is about to perish, and yet they put up signs prohibiting us from loving our country. It is the great union of the Chinese people. Compatriots, we must make an effort, we must develop our forces to the maximum. The future is ours." In China, student protest was as old as the empire itself. In the 1st century BC, some 30,000 students of the imperial school joined together in an organized protest against the dismissal of an imperial official. In several crises over the next 2 millennia, students in schools and universities claimed the right to act as spokespersons for Chinese public opinion. The publications of the May 4th movement meant that Chinese students, in 1919, regained their role. Until World War I, Chinese intellectuals were not linked to Marxist theories. It is necessary to point out that Chen Tusu, who in 1921 would be the first leader of the Chinese Communist Party, did not seek the salvation of China in the ideas of Marx and Lenin, but in democracy and science, the foundations of Western civilization. However, the political setback at Versailles produced in China, as in most Chinese intellectuals, a deep disillusionment with the West. "No sun rises for China in the West," Chen said. Less than a month after the Treaty of Versailles, Bolshevik Russia renounced all Tsarist impositions against China and returned the seized territories. The contrast between Russia's behavior and that of the Western powers was striking. Sun Yat-sen, who was an ardent Westernist, abandoned Wilson for Lenin. "The only allies and brothers of the Chinese people in the struggle for national freedom," he said in a manifesto in July 1919, "are the Soviet workers, peasants, and soldiers." Sun Yat-sen and the Canton Republicans, now called the Kuomintang, or Nationalist Party, were ignored by the Western powers, as they waited for the emergence of a military leader strong enough to impose a dictatorship. Instead, the Russian communists offered Sun Yat-sen and his followers solidarity and support. In January 1922, Kuomintang delegates attended a Far Eastern Workers' Congress in Moscow. The following autumn, one of the best Soviet diplomats, Adolf Joffe, arrived in China to negotiate an alliance with Sun Yat-sen. They both agreed that communism is not appropriate to current Chinese conditions. Russia promised the Kuomintang weapons, money, and political and military advisors. Political advisors, inspired by the principles of democratic centralism, turned the Kuomintang into an effective political organization. The military advisors founded the Whampoa Military Academy, which, within a few years, provided the Canton government, previously at the mercy of local warlords, with a powerful army. The first head of the academy was the young and ambitious nationalist General Chiang Kai-shek. The alliance with Russia increased the influence of the young Communist Party. For several years, some communists held important positions in the administration. Mao Zedong headed the propaganda department of the Kuomintang Central Committee. Zhou Enlai, later Prime Minister of the People's Republic of China, was the chief political advisor at the Whampoa Military Academy. In 1925, on his deathbed, Sun Yat-sen wrote his last letter to the Central Committee of the Russian Communist Party. In it he placed his hope in the alliance of a free and strong China with the Soviet Union in the great struggle for the emancipation of the oppressed peoples of the world. Before his death, Sun Yat-sen dreamed that Kuomintang armies would advance north from Canton and bring China under nationalist control. In July 1926, the Northern Army, under the command of General Chiang Kai-shek, left Canton with the aim of turning those dreams into reality. Less than 2 years later, in June 1928, Chiang Kai-shek's forces entered the rival capital, Peking. The following month, he led his troops towards the Green Cloud Monastery, where Sun Yat-sen's body had been waiting to be buried for 3 years. Before the leader's corpse, Chiang Kai-shek solemnly declared that the unity of China had been restored. However, that unit was only nominal, because although it had achieved the support of many of the local military leaders, they were not under its control. The nationalist government was never able to free itself from its dependence. Chiang Kai-shek was no admirer of the West, but neither was he an admirer of Soviet Russia. He returned from a visit to Moscow in 1923, particularly convinced that what the Russians call internationalism and world revolution is nothing more than imperialism, but publicly he expressed himself differently. If Russia helps the Chinese Revolution, does that mean that communism should be implanted in China? No, it wants us to carry out the national revolution. If the communists join the Kuomintang, does that mean that they intend to implement communism? No, they don't intend it either. Privately, I suspected otherwise. The Russians, although suspicious of Chiang's intentions, believed that the Chinese communists would cooperate with him until they were strong enough to overthrow him. Chiang Kai-shek now decided that the Northern Expedition would not only unify China, but must destroy communism. In April 1927, a communist uprising gave him the pretext to occupy Shanghai, and he began a systematic persecution of communists, until then his collaborators. The purification movement, as the attempted extermination of the Chinese Communist Party was euphemistically defined, quickly spread to other parts of the country controlled by nationalist forces. During the years following the First World War, Asia began to transform slowly but irreversibly. Japan, which had begun its modernization long before other powers in the region, was no longer a developing country, it was a power seeking its place in global balance. His intervention in the Russian war and sending troops to Siberia showed that he was no longer just observing. Japan acted, took positions and tested its military capabilities outside its borders. Although over the years it tried to appear a certain moderation, partially reducing its army and participating in international agreements, that stability was fragile and superficial. Japanese democracy, although existing, lacked solidity. The governments were weak and the influence of the military grew silently, without the need to impose itself directly, simply occupying the space that politics could not control. Then came the final blow, the global economic crisis. The collapse of international trade directly affected Japan, especially its main export product, silk, whose price plummeted, causing a devastating impact on the country's economy and the lives of millions of people. Discontent grew, uncertainty increased, and in that vacuum the army began to consolidate itself as the only structure capable of offering a way out. Many of its officers no longer belonged to the traditional elite, they were men of humble origins trained in a context of crisis, with a different, more direct, and more radical mentality. For them, the solution was not within the country, but outside. Expansion became a necessity not only strategically, but also economically and psychologically. In 1931, that vision became action. The Manchurian incident marked a turning point. An explosion on a railway line under Japanese control was used as a pretext, a sufficient excuse to begin a military operation that was already prepared. The troops advanced quickly, without encountering organized resistance, occupying the territory in a matter of weeks. The Japanese government, surprised by the speed of events, tried to intervene, but control was no longer in its hands. The army acted on its own. In a short time, the region was completely transformed and converted into a new state, Manchukuo, an apparently independent entity but in reality controlled by Japan, under a political structure designed to legitimize its presence. The international community reacted, but without force. The League of Nations condemned the action, but imposed no real consequences. There was no intervention or effective pressure. Japan interpreted that response as a sign, a confirmation that it could advance without direct opposition, and decided to leave the organization, definitively breaking with the international system established after the First World War. The global balance was slowly collapsing again, silently, but with profound consequences. Meanwhile, in China, the situation was even more complex. The country remained fragmented, divided between different political forces and weakened by internal conflicts. In this context, a figure emerged who would shape the future of the country, Mao Zedong. Their leadership did not emerge from the cities or from the elites, but from the countryside, from the rural areas where the population lived in extreme conditions and where government control was limited. Unlike other leaders, Mao understood that China's strength was not in its institutions, but in its people, in the peasants, in those who had no power but did have numbers and resistance. His strategy broke with traditional models. He did not seek direct confrontations nor did he intend to conquer cities immediately. His approach was different: build from the bottom, resist, wear down and advance little by little. It was a different war, a prolonged war based on patience, knowledge of the terrain and the ability to adapt. While Japan advanced from the outside, China reorganized from the inside, and conflict between both movements became inevitable. Asia was no longer a secondary stage. It was becoming the center of a new stage, a stage marked by expansion, resistance, and the total transformation of the world balance. The situation in China was unprecedented in modern history. The tensions accumulated over decades, external influences and internal weakness had created a completely unstable scenario. In this context, Mao Zedong emerged as a different figure, a leader who did not fit into traditional power schemes or conventional political strategies. Unlike other leaders, Mao did not trust in the strength of the cities or institutional control. His focus was focused on the countryside, in the rural areas where most of the Chinese population lived. For him, the revolution should not be built from above, but from below, organizing the masses, giving them consciousness, structure, and purpose. The Red Army was not just a military force. It was also a political tool, an instrument to educate, mobilize, and transform the population. Its objective was not only to fight, but to turn the peasants into a revolutionary force capable of sustaining deep and lasting change. Meanwhile, external pressure continued to grow. Japanese aggression, which had already begun in previous stages, was intensifying. This conflict not only affected the territory, but also China's perception of the world. If in the past the country had tried to maintain a certain relationship with the West, now the situation was different. The new Japanese aggression, much broader and more systematic, generated a change in mentality. China was beginning to distance itself from the Western powers, understanding that the international balance did not offer real guarantees of protection. This context, marked by external pressure and internal fragmentation, created the necessary conditions for the communist movement to gain strength. The recent history of China, from the Opium Wars to the consolidation of the new political model, could be interpreted as a period of transition. An interval in which the country sought to redefine its identity, its structure, and its position in the world. As the century progressed, China once again adopted a posture of isolation, similar to that it had maintained in previous centuries. But this time it was not a decision based on cultural self-sufficiency, but on distrust of an international system that had demonstrated its inability to maintain balance. In this context, Mao's revolutionary strategy evolved. Although in theory it adopted elements of classical Marxism, in practice it adapted to Chinese reality. The prominence of the industrial proletariat, central in other models, remained in the background. Instead, the peasantry became the core of the revolution. This transformation was not minor. It meant completely redefining the concept of revolutionary struggle. The revolution was no longer conceived as an immediate urban uprising, but as a prolonged process, based on the accumulation of force in the countryside, the progressive attrition of the adversary and the construction of a solid base before the decisive confrontation. Lin Pao, one of Mao's closest collaborators, formulated this idea clearly. According to his vision, the world could be understood as a relationship between cities and fields on a large scale. The industrialized powers represented the cities of the world, while Asia, Africa, and Latin America constituted the countryside. From that perspective, the global revolution should not begin in the centers of power, but in the peripheries. The objective was to surround the large structures from the outside, progressively weakening them until their fall was inevitable. The Chinese strategy thus became a broader model. It was no longer just a response to the country's internal situation, but a proposal that could be applied globally. In this way, the revolution in China ceased to be an isolated phenomenon and became part of a deeper transformation. A transformation that would not only affect the internal balance of the country, but also the international order as a whole. What was happening in Asia was not an isolated conflict. It was the beginning of a deeper transformation. A change in the balance of the world. As Europe prepared for war. In the East, another force was beginning to take shape.